At an inn in a very cold place, a group of people drank and talked about a crazy man who ran like a wild animal across the battlefield. They said he was a mercenary, but acted like he didn't care about dying. Whenever he finished a fight, he disappeared and appeared in another one. They commented that he didn't value his own life, which seemed interesting, especially because at the end of each battle, he always said it was a shame he was still alive. If there were ever a war involving the Empire, that man would surely be there. Many believed he fought more for revenge than for money. One of those present became curious and asked his name. The answer was that, according to rumors, he was a prince from a fallen kingdom and seemed to be just looking for a place to die. At that moment, a knight approached a man with a sad, tired, and empty expression. He said the only way he had found to keep going was self-torture. That man was Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol. The name Briol had become dishonored, stained by the ruin of a kingdom. It was then explained what had happened 10 years earlier. In a random casino, Yuri Briol, also known as the Lucky One, the only survivor of a fallen kingdom, was betting everything he had. At only 18 years old, he was winning repeatedly, which caught the attention of Hernando, a court mage, who was impressed and asked how he was doing it. Yuri simply replied that he was just lucky that day, that he wasn't doing anything special. Gradually, the other players gave up and left the place. Yuri, however, asked to double the bets. Hernando warned him it was better to leave, because if they stayed any longer, it would be too late. Then someone approached and said he should have run while he still could walk, asking if he really thought he would get away after deceiving them. They accused Yuri of cheating. He asked if they knew who he was. One of them replied that, judging by his behavior, he was certainly not a noble, maybe some insignificant little king. Others said that was even more reason to pick a fight with him, since provoking the Empire was always a good excuse to start a war. They said princes were all like their fathers, worthless. Faced with the provocations, Yuri lost control, flipped the table on them, and angrily declared they had better listen. He was Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol, and he promised they were about to get beaten up. And so they did, as he easily defeated them. Later, Yuri was explaining himself. He said he was late because his father had summoned him to an emergency meeting. He explained that he had sent a message to her by carrier pigeon and asked to be forgiven just this once. She was Ekaterina Luarna Granzian, princess of the Empire. Ekaterina replied that he acted like he was the only one making an effort in the Empire, when she also had to hide and overcome obstacles to get there. Yuri acknowledged his mistake and said he needed to be more careful. He also said what he was about to say couldn't be shared with anyone. Ekaterina then asked if, to him, she was everyone. Yuri tried to explain, saying that wasn't it, but she asked why he had given her that gift. She asked if it was because he didn't trust her, and suggested he give it to another woman he trusted more. She added that she wouldn't reach out to him again until she herself decided to. Yuri, confused, just asked her to come back. He wondered how he was supposed to deal with a woman like that, thinking that, this time, it really would be hard to be forgiven. Meanwhile, someone was listening to the entire conversation. It was explained that, after that day, the already unstable relationship between the Kingdom of Briol and the Empire broke completely. The Empire let go of provocations and crossed every line. The conflict between the two nations escalated until the Empire finally invaded Briol. The castle was consumed by flames, and Yuri could do nothing. The war against the Empire had begun, and from the very start, they were crushed. Time passed like an eternity. Many sacrificed themselves, and it felt like the war would never end. Yuri fought on the front lines, lost allies, shed blood and sweat to protect what was left of his territory. At that time, the most powerful man on the continent and the strongest weapon of Briol was Fiore Briol. Without his presence, the Empire began to turn the war in its favor. At first, Yuri thought it was just a coincidence, but over time he could no longer deny the truth behind it all. After reflecting on his past countless time between life and death battle, he reached one logical conclusion. Katerina had betrayed him. She was the one who leaked all the information. As soon as he told her that his father would be leaving Briol, the war began. He wanted to believe he was wrong, but the only response he received from Ekaterina Luarna Granzian was an apology. That sent him into despair. Even tired and with almost no allies, Yuri stayed on the battlefield, facing most of the enemies alone on the front lines, until he was completely surrounded by Imperial soldiers. There was nothing else he could do. He was unarmed and accepted his death, but someone took the blow for him. Laurent had sacrificed himself so that His Majesty could live. Other soldiers of Briol did the same, fighting to protect the royal lineage. Yuri turned his back and fled his own territory. At first he kid, but he knew he couldn't stay there forever. He needed to leave, to find a way. He didn't know what had happened to his father, but since he hadn't returned by then, he was likely dead. Eventually, Yuri was also found. He thought that if he died there, Briol would truly fall. Everyone would die. He begged to live. He said that if he died, Briol would not survive. He thought his knights had sacrificed themselves for him. But the man before him just apologized. He didn't explain much, only said that the Empire would one day pay for its sins, that Imperial soldiers would set foot on that land, and that Yuri should flee. Yuri didn't know why he had been helped, but understood that he needed to escape. He needed to live. He needed revenge. He needed to rebuild Briol. But that was just a childish thought. A distant dream. Reality was much more cruel. Everyone had died, and he couldn't understand why all that blood had been shed. He couldn't even imagine the reason. At that moment, all he did was punish himself. But one day, someone would show up to truly kill him. This was the legend of the Prince of a Fallen Kingdom. He was searching for a place to die. He always threw himself into the most dangerous battles, risking himself with extreme tactics. The knight watching him concluded that his solution had been self-torture. He said Yuri didn't deserve death. He knew exactly who was standing before him. It was Yuri Briol, the third prince. Yuri thought everyone who knew about his past was dead. The knight then revealed that it was all his fault. The fall of the kingdom had been his fault. This man was Laurent. Yuri recognized him by his voice, even though he clearly remembered seeing him die right in front of him. Laurent repeated that everything had been his fault. The kingdom fell because of him. No heir remained to rebuild the throne. It was Yuri's fault that the kingdom had lost its honor. Yuri thought the man before him was a ghost, someone who should be dead and had come to punish him for his sins. When he was stabbed, Yuri thought that dying like that wasn't as good as he had imagined. He thought he would feel something different. In reality, he realized he was punishing himself even in the moment of his death. But then he remembered something his father had once said. The successors of Briol never abandon their honor, no matter what happens. At that moment, Yuri woke up in his bed. As a child, it was clear that this was the work of regression. What else could it be? A sad and dramatic story like Game of Thrones? A story about death and survival? No, this was a story of new beginnings. Beside him was his father, asking if he was all right. He could hardly believe his son had slept for 3 days straight. Yuri thought he was seeing another ghost. His father should have been dead. He concluded that he had ended up in hell. In a way, it made sense. For someone who always put honor above all, hell seemed like a fitting destination. He was sure his father had lived a decadent life, but Fiore Briol simply slapped him across the face and asked what he was talking about, calling him a brat. Yuri commented that his father was still mean, even in hell, saying he should reconsider his behavior after all. It wasn't too late yet. However, something surprised him. He noticed the beautiful landscape around him, the leaves gently falling, and then he realized that there was no one else there. None of the demons he saw in life, no fires of hell, no sinners. Everything was peaceful. Yuri tried to understand what was happening, but before he could reach any conclusion, he passed out again. This was Yuri Briol, now back to being 13 years old. At first he thought it was just a dream or some sort of deja vu before death, because no matter how tired he was, he couldn't wake up. The memories, the events of his life, everything began to repeat exactly as before, and little by little, he began to accept it. Yuri finally understood he had gone back to the past. To the spring of the year, he turned 13. He had been given a new chance. Early in the morning, someone came to wake him up, as he had asked to be called at that time. It was time for his sword training. As soon as he opened his eyes, he got up quickly and began to change clothes, but his maid, Ina, said he could take it easy as he needed to wash his face first. At that moment, Yuri remembered how devastated he was when he saw Ina's death in the future, and emotionally asked her to slap him hard to confirm if that was really real. Ina was startled, asking if he wanted her to commit a crime against him, but Yuri replied that it wasn't a crime if it was a direct order. He was Yuri Briol, and he never went back on his word. The slap was so hard that he screamed and staggered back. Later, during sword training, his face was swollen, and he thought about how he had forgotten that woman's strength. Still, no one offered medicine or ointment, and everyone just whispered behind his back. Not even Bernard, his fencing instructor, said anything about his cheek. Yuri thought that old man no longer corrected his posture. He just made him swing the sword around with no purpose. He wondered since when Bernard had been teaching only through direct sparring, with no technique. At one point, Bernard commented to the king that the prince had been born with blessed talent, but had apparently lost it. He said that if he were just a little more dedicated, he could have become the best swordsman in the kingdom. Yuri heard it all. He realized that at that point in his life, he himself had not been cooperative in training, and that's why the lessons had turned into empty fights, with no technique or learning. After that, instead of improving, he had just become lazier. Determined to change, Yuri told Bernard that from that day forward, he wanted to be properly taught. He said he would give his best. asked. Bernard replied that he didn't know what had brought about this change, but he understood. He used his aura and declared that from that moment on, the training would be serious. He charged at Yuri so fast he could barely defend himself and complained that he should at least give him time before attacking that hard. Even so, Yuri acknowledged that he had forgotten the power of that man. Bernard, after all, had once been called the Sword Demon. The training went on for quite some time, and in the end, Yuri was exhausted, nearly dead from fatigue. He thought that this was what real training with the Sword Demon was like. If not for the experience he had gained as a mercenary in his past life, he wouldn't even be able to move at that point. But despite being extremely tiring, he knew that if he kept going like that, he would develop much faster. Bernard was also impressed. Even clumsily, Yuri had blocked all his strikes. Suddenly, Ina appeared, desperate, with an emergency message. She said His Majesty was looking for him and that he needed to leave immediately. Count Johannes had brought his son, which made Yuri alert. He remembered that this was the traitor who had sided with the Empire and opened the gates to the enemy army, Goth Barkvar. Yuri thought to himself that that bastard was here and asked Ina where that scoundrel was. Later during dinner, everyone was at the table. Yuri behaved calmly and politely, as if nothing had happened. One of the guests commented that the third prince had changed a lot and that his physique looked great. Fiore said it didn't even seem like that was his son, joking that he probably ate something strange to have changed so much. The other princes laughed and said they wanted to eat that too. Then Fiore turned to the guest and said his son was smart too, right? The visitor replied yes, although in some areas he still had weaknesses. When Count Johannes' son, Goth Barkvar, looked at one of the princes, he was enchanted, but when he looked at Yuri, he almost wet himself in fear, for Yuri was staring at him with a deadly gaze. The second prince noticed the tension and asked Yuri if there was something between him and that boy. Yuri whispered that yes, that boy had betrayed him, stabbed him in the back. The second prince then asked if he would let that slide, reminding him that he was the third prince, Yuri Briol. Yuri thought that boy always pretended to be polite, noble, and honorable, but had always been rotten from the beginning. He finally revealed his true look. Yuri concluded that a good beating might straighten that boy out, and that it would be for Goth's own good, to prevent the past life from repeating. He remembered that, in his previous life, he had fought Goth at exactly that same moment, and now this had become a great opportunity. Later, Yuri threw a wooden sword to Goth, saying he knew he was decent with a sword. Goth confirmed he had some skill, but asked why Yuri wanted to know that so suddenly. Yuri replied that this kingdom was no place for narrow-minded knights. Goth responded that he was still just a child, not even a knight. Meanwhile, the second prince simply watched everything. Yuri replied that even so, he was destined to become a knight who would serve that kingdom. Goth admitted that, technically, that was true. Yuri then declared that, for that reason, he was challenging him to a duel, and charged at him with brutality. Goth managed to block the first strike, but Yuri kicked sand into his eyes. Goth protested that this wasn't part of the knight's code, but Yuri ignored him, dropped his sword, and went for hand-to-hand combat. With a kick, he knocked Goth down like a sack of potatoes, completely overpowering him. While holding him to the ground, Yuri recalled that in his previous life, Goth had betrayed his own father's honor by passing information to the Empire that led to Briol's downfall. He said that Goth's father was a respectable knight and a great count loyal to the king, and asked why Goth thought a position like that existed, what its true purpose was. Yuri understood that Goth only wanted to survive, but in this life Briol would not fall. Goth replied that it was a difficult question. Yuri concluded that there would be no more knights with weak convictions in that army, and that included himself. He rephrased the question. He wanted to know why Goth's father was a count, and who had given him that power. He said that regardless of the situation, Goth needed to understand what that represented and reflect on the words he had just heard from a prince. Goth replied that he would, and then walked away. The second prince, who was nearby, said that it wasn't bad at all and admitted that Yuri fought very well. Yuri asked if he thought he would lose, and the second prince replied that yes, he did. He also said that he no longer knew what to think of Yuri, since he had always been the biggest troublemaker in the kingdom, as well as the greatest gambler. Yuri stated that he would no longer live like that he would leave that kind of nonsense behind. The second prince was even shocked, asking if he had hit his head somewhere. Later, when the sun was already setting, Yuri was still training with his sword. He had spent the whole day at it. Bernard praised the effort and said they could stop there, but then got serious and said it was time for Yuri to learn a mana technique. Yuri asked if Bernard would teach him his own method, but Bernard said no. He said he would teach him the best method for someone of royal blood, the Briol method. This was a refined method with a perfectly balanced energy flow, efficient and excellent. Yuri thought that in his past life, he had mastered the Briol method, almost reaching the peak of the technique, even though he had only been a mercenary. Bernard asked if he was considering something else, and Yuri replied that he was just reflecting. He then asked Bernard to recommend someone from the Royal Guard for him, someone who might not be very skilled yet, but had exceptional potential. Yuri believed there was another technique he hadn't learned in his past life. Bernard thought for a moment and said that if he was looking for raw potential, the best name was Jared. Yuri only knew Jared superficially. In his past life, he had met him at the end of the war. Jared's skills were so mediocre that it was surprising he was still alive at that point. He was such a pathetic knight that he barely seemed to have undergone any training, but even so, Jared had once said that if he could go back in time, he would train like he was in hell. Yuri thought that guy had incredible natural talent, but had never refined the gift he had received. When the war finally arrived, both of their swords were rusted. Determined to change that fate, Yuri decided to find Jared, his potential knight, because he thought it was time to knock some sense into his head. Later, he went to the knight's training center, saying he was just there to check on how everyone was doing. One of the knights replied that they were all working hard and giving their best. Yuri acknowledged that it was true, since the Knights of Briol had always been very dedicated, but he specifically asked about Jared. The commander pointed to the corner of the field and said that the recruit was over there. That was when Yuri saw the problem. What Bernard had said earlier made perfect sense. Improving one's skills during training is essential, but Jared was only swinging his sword mechanically, without any real effort. That was why he had become a rusted sword in the future. Yuri asked Rosso for a wooden sword, saying he wanted to practice with one of the knights. Rosso agreed, but warned that he himself would face Yuri, who then replied that he wanted to fight that lazy guy over there, referring to Jared. Later, everyone had gathered to watch the duel, including the commander. The knights warned the rookie to be careful since he would be facing the prince. Yuri said he was tired of hearing that Jared had great potential as a knight, and wanted to see with his own eyes what kind of warrior he was. Jared accepted the challenge, and Yuri asked him not to disappoint him. Yuri advanced quickly, and to everyone's surprise, Jared managed to block the first strikes. The knights commented that Jared's movements were precise and sharp, but even so, the prince was doing very well against him. Jared soon noticed something strange. Yuri's attacks had an unusual consistency. The distance of the blows was always exact, and the boy's skills were far above average. It was as if he perfectly matched Jared's fighting rhythm. Yuri thought it was all boring, as it was still just a basic performance. He decided to pick up the pace, making his strikes stronger. Even so, Jared managed to keep blocking, showing excellent reflexes, even dodging and countering some attacks. Still, it wasn't easy for him, which was unexpected from a child. When Jared moved to counterattack, Yuri barely managed to block all the strikes. Even with the experience of a past life, his body was still that of a child, so he didn't expect to win, but at least wanted to give Jared a hard time. At the right moment, he delivered a strike that almost disarmed Jared, broke through his guard, and hit his shoulder. The other knights were impressed that he managed to do that. Yuri asked if Jared was holding back, and he replied that he wasn't, but he found it all very strange. He thought he was pressuring Yuri, but then he found himself surrounded by faster and more precise attacks. One blow nearly hit his neck, but he dodged just in time. Irritated, Jared decided to use his mana control technique even against a child, and everyone was shocked by that decision. Even so, Yuri managed to dodge, though a piece of his hair was cut. Everyone said Jared was crazy and asked if the prince was okay. Yuri replied that he was fine since fights always ended like that, and told Jared to pick up his sword again. Putting a bandage over the wound, Yuri smiled and said now it was getting fun, so there was no reason to stop. The next exchange of blows was much more intense, with heavy strikes from both sides. Jared realized the prince was very different from him, because Yuri was pushing himself to the limit, raising the level of the fight to the maximum, using everything he had. In the middle of the battle, Jared felt his blood boiling, something that had never happened, not even when facing a stronger opponent. He began to wear down Yuri's guard, and understood that this young prince was awakening something inside him. At a moment of advantage, Jared dodged a blow and found an opening for a counterattack. His downward strike was so strong it split Yuri's sword in half. Yuri then declared it was over, Jared had won, and acknowledged that he only managed it because he used a mana technique. Even so, Yuri said he had learned something important from him, and thanked him. Jared replied that he should be the one thanking, as he had never seen a fighting spirit and obsession as strong as Yuri's. He wondered how someone so young could have such determination. Seeing Jared silent, Yuri asked why he was standing still after making the prince bleed. He said it wasn't the time to stand there, so Jared went to get something to treat the wound. Yuri took the opportunity to collapse from exhaustion, while the other knights commented on how amazing it had been. At that moment, the captain of Bryol's royal guard, Sanid, approached, observing the situation with interest to understand exactly what had happened. A few days later, Jared was walking around the area when he encountered Yuri again, the third prince. Yuri asked him to come along, saying he had something to show. Jared replied that he needed to train, but Yuri asked if he had finally fixed his mindset, since he owed him that. As he had to repay that debt, Jared agreed. Yuri thought that finally Jared had some motivation, though it still wasn't enough. But for now, it was decent. Jared asked where they were going, but Yuri said he wouldn't say anything, and that it wouldn't be dangerous. He also said he would call someone else to go with them and shouted down the hall for Hernando, the royal court mage. Hernando asked what the prince wanted, and Yuri said he needed assistance for where they were going. Hernando said he'd love to help but was busy, until Yuri reminded him about the gambling debt he owed him. Hernando asked if he was serious, and Yuri assured him he was, reminding him he had never lied to him. Hernando commented that outside the casino that was true, and Yuri thought it was bad that his title as third prince seemed to mean nothing. Yuri then said Jared would be the witness to his word, and so both should accompany him. Hernando, convinced, agreed, but wanted to know where they were going. Yuri revealed that the destination was the sword in the mountain, where they would retrieve all the treasures of the ancestors' dungeon. Later, already inside the dungeon, Hernando commented that he didn't even know a place like that existed in the kingdom. Jared asked what was at the end of that cave, and Yuri explained it was where the sword in the mountain lay. Jared recognized the legend of the family's progenitor, and Yuri confirmed it, remembering that in his past life, when the Empire took Briol's territory, they discovered this dungeon with the sacred relic hiding the entire legacy of the Briol family. At the time, it caused a huge uproar, but the path they now followed had only been used as an escape route. Because of that, the legacy was handed over to the Empire before any of the Briols even knew it existed. But now, Yuri had a second chance. He knew everything, was no longer in a hurry, and would not flee like in the past. He would move forward, see the relic with his own eyes, the legacy of the Briol ancestor. As they crossed a shadowy corridor, they reached a kind of clearing. Hernando noticed the path led straight into the mountain, and asked where the prince got the key to that door. Yuri thought he wouldn't say, but he knew it was hidden in the study room, just like in his past life. Back then, he paid the price for not using the knowledge he had, but now he was making the most of everything. Along the way, Hernando got injured by sharp branches that were like rose thorns. Yuri warned them to be careful, saying that they just needed to follow him closely to avoid getting hurt. As Yuri walked ahead, Hernando called Jared and asked if the prince had eaten something strange recently. Jared replied that he also found his behavior odd, but Yuri told them both to hurry up. Hernando commented that the prince's temperament hadn't changed much. Then Yuri suddenly stopped and asked for silence. He had sensed a wolf pack nearby and warned that they were moving in a group, which made it impossible to tell how many there were. Jared asked how he knew that, and Yuri replied that he had read it in a book. Hernando, surprised, just asked how come Yuri had read a book. Yuri said the wolves hadn't noticed them yet, so they just had to move slowly and carefully. But as always, Hernando stepped on a dry branch, giving away their position. He tried to apologize, but it was too late. A wolf lunged at him and his head was nearly torn off. Jared had to act quickly and cut the wolf's neck before the worst could happen. Yuri commented that he didn't do too badly, but the problem was that this attack had drawn the attention of the alpha wolf, who was preparing to kill them all and was already howling to summon the rest of the pack. Jared told the two of them to stay behind him and imbued his blade with mana. When the wolves charged, he reacted fast enough to kill two at once. Hernando praised him, saying that was expected from a knight of the royal guard. Yuri agreed, saying that he did indeed have a lot of skill, but that still wasn't good enough, as there were many wolves left, and Jared was already beginning to show signs of fatigue. Yuri then commented to Hernando that his father didn't trust the magical abilities he had, but Yuri believed he could have improved. Hernando asked if the prince wanted to see the full power of a battle mage, and without waiting for an answer, summoned several fireballs. Jared, confused, only understood what was happening when he saw a fireball coming straight at him, but he managed to move in time, and the explosion hit only the wolves. Later, despite the delays caused by all those setbacks, they finally reached the peak of the Sword Mountain. Jared looked around and asked if that place was really the destination, since there didn't seem to be anything there, let alone a sacred relic. But Yuri knew it was the right place. He was sure of it. He said they just weren't seeing what they were supposed to yet. Soon after, he spotted a small glowing stone and told the others they needed to pull it out. Hernando, exhausted, complained that the mission was too hard for a mage. When they pulled the stone, they saw it was embedded in the hilt of a sword. It was indeed the sword of the mountain. Hernando noted that it looked brand new, as if it had just come out of the forge. Engraved on the blade was the word guilty. Jared asked if that was the founder's relic. Yuri replied that no one could be certain, but at that moment, the entire mountain began to shake. Yuri said they would find out soon enough, and the ground gave way. They all fell fell into a massive underground cavern. Curiously, the place where they landed had a large crystal with a magical aura. Jared was almost in tears as Yuri had landed right on top of him. Luckily, Jared had used his mana technique to protect himself. Yuri said it wasn't a bad landing. Hernando, on the other hand, wasn't even dirty, as he had floated down using magic and commented that the place was deeper than he imagined. Yuri, annoyed, asked if the court mage had really ignored the prince's safety just to protect himself. Hernando replied that it was an emergency and he didn't have time to think clearly. Suddenly, Hernando heard a strange sound and, turning around, saw something that left him speechless. It was a ghost. Yuri told him to stop changing the subject, but then also turned and saw the same thing. In front of them was a Death Knight. Yuri knew that kind of enemy well and told Jared to get up. Since Jared was feeling lazy, Yuri had to kick him to wake him up. Jared, still dazed, asked where they were, but when he looked ahead and saw the Death Knight, he panicked. Even so, he drew his sword and stood in front of the prince, saying he would deal with the enemy. Yuri thought he wasn't too bad, since he reacted quickly. He remembered that, as the name suggested, a Death Knight was someone who had returned from the dead. When an experienced knight died and became one of them, they became even stronger than they were in life. However, Yuri stated that this one wasn't dangerous. He could feel that it was only guarding the dungeon, and showed no hostility, especially toward him, who had the founder's blood. And indeed, when Yuri approached, the Death Knight didn't attack. He simply drew his sword and stabbed it into the ground with no intention of fighting. Hernando, impressed, commented that it looked like his head had been split in half. Yuri told him to watch his mouth, and Hernando tried to correct himself, saying he was referring to the hair. Suddenly, the Death Knight said that Yuri's attitude was condescending, just like his. Yuri, confused, asked who this person was, and the knight replied that he was Eric Briol. Hernando was surprised and said that anyone knew who that man was, the swordsman who conquered the whole continent with a single blade, the founder of the Briol family, and the first king. Yuri asked if he was really the first one to make it there since the founder's time. The knight replied yes, and that if he weren't a Briol descendant, he wouldn't have even been able to take the sword that was now in his hands. Jared asked if that was truly the treasure left by the founder, and the Death Knight replied that he had used that sword. Yuri made a strange face and said he felt a bit sick after touching it, but the knight ignored the comment and asked the Briol descendant to reveal the reason for his coming. Yuri then formally introduced himself as Yuri Briol, the third prince of the current generation of Briol, and requested that the founder's legacy be passed on to him. The knight, upon hearing this, simply turned around and declared that the time had finally come to fulfill his duty. He would ensure that Yuri received what he was seeking. Yuri followed him in silence. Meanwhile, Jared watched everything in perplexity, thinking that none of it made any sense. They were inside the founder's dungeon, carved into the mountain, and they were speaking with a Death Knight. He had never imagined something like this could happen in his life. Yuri interrupted his thoughts by asking why he was standing still, and at that moment Jared had a vision of his past life. He remembered a conversation with the prince himself and thought he was hallucinating, seeing meaningless things. Soon after, he returned to reality and decided to follow the prince. The Death Knight approached the large crystal in the center of the cave and sat in front of it, and the crystal began to glow intensely. He said he hoped all of this would be worth it. In the next second, Yuri opened his eyes in a completely different place. He had no idea where he was and saw a figure approaching. He asked if it was the founder, but quickly realized it was not human. It was a faceless, colorless, humanoid creature that immediately tried to strike him with a sword. That creature could use mana, more specifically a mana method. It began to touch its own chest and its blade, guiding the magical energy with precision. Yuri realized it was showing him how to use that power, as if it were a practical training session. The creature was inviting him to try, and Yuri wondered if he was supposed to copy the movements in the middle of that strange fight. He thought his ancestor must have been crazy to train someone who had not yet mastered a mana method. But then he understood. That was one of the best teaching methods. Real practice in combat. Only someone with a second chance in life could truly take advantage of it. He then managed to use mana through that method and caught the creature's attention. With his blade imbued with energy, still unsure of what he was doing, he launched himself into combat. Yuri thought he needed to become stronger, because soon the Empire would grow more ambitious and try to conquer the kingdom again. This time he would destroy the Empire completely. He would not make the same mistakes as before, and the swordsmanship of Eric Briol, his ancestor, would lead it all. He would absorb this legacy no matter the cost. He and the creature exchanged blows with smiles on their faces, like two warriors satisfied amidst the battlefield. Later, Jared woke up in the castle's training grounds. His hair was singed, so he realized it had not been an ordinary dream. He felt that something was hiding in the shadows. When the figure finally appeared, Jared came came face to face with a doppelganger, a copy of himself. It was probably a test left behind by the Death Knight. Jared asked its name, and the copy answered Jared, just like him. It said there was no point in trying to escape destiny, because he would never truly become a royal guard. It claimed that his real desire was to live a quiet life, far from the third prince, because the closer he got to him, the more miserable his life would become. Jared took a deep breath and thought that if he were his past self, he would have agreed. But that boy, Yuri, had lit a flame within him. He replied that the copy knew nothing because it was only a shadow. He said that a sword, once thrust, cannot be pulled back, no matter how much you think before striking. The more you think, the cloudier the strike becomes. The copy called that way of thinking arrogant, and with a monoblade, launched an attack. The two Jareds were evenly matched in power. The original realized that the opponent was cautious, avoided risks, and used a defensive sword style. The Jared of the past would have lost that fight, but the current one wanted something more. He wanted a fun fight, not a boring and predictable duel. And that's how he struck the copy squarely in the chest. Upon impact, no blood came out of the armor, only a dark and disgusting sludge. The copy then dissolved and revealed its true form, a large golem. Jared instantly understood that this was indeed a test from the Death Knight. He was also certain that the prince was facing something similar at that moment. He thought Yuri needed to win. Meanwhile, the desert looked like a war zone. The rocks were marked by the clash of blades, and the prince seemed defeated, sunken into one of them. The creature approached to deliver the final blow, creating a massive explosion. But that explosion was actually caused by the impact of its sword against the prince's, who had managed to stand at the last moment. Yuri wondered how much time had passed since he entered that test, which was now much more dangerous than when it began. Still, thanks to the prolonged duel, he had learned to use a new mana method. Now, with that body, he could wield his sword properly. He realized something important. The creature was still standing, untouched, but its sword was almost completely destroyed, and in the next second, it turned to dust. Right after that, everything around them began to disappear. Not just the creature, but also the space they were in. Yuri understood that time had run out, and silently gave thanks for the lesson. Slowly, he opened his eyes and returned to reality. Both of them were already awake. Jared was standing, and the Death Knight commented that they had a good dream. Yuri asked what exactly that had been, and the knight explained that it was a plan left behind by Eric, as he knew that eventually one of Briol's heirs would show up there. Yuri thought that, in his past life, the Sword Mountain had been completely destroyed, which had prevented any member of the Briol family from reaching that dungeon and receiving the test left by the founder. He asked if the founder used mana methods, but the knight replied that he did not. That method had been Eric's final legacy, the result of all the knowledge he acquired during his travels and battles. He was the first to master the so-called pure method. Yuri asked why that power had not been passed down directly to the heirs, and the knight explained that the dungeon only opens at the right moment. The fact that it had opened now meant that it was time to use that power, but the exact reason should be discovered by Yuri himself. When he asked the name of the method, the knight replied that it was called Soul Fracture. Then he asked the third prince to kneel to receive the elder's legacy. When Yuri did so, the knight placed his hand on his head and told him to never fear any enemy, to act according to his convictions, and to fulfill the duty of the Briols until the end of his life. Before disappearing, the knight pulled Yuri's hair and ordered him to remember that firmly. A Briol never abandons their honor, even if it means their own death, for that is the duty of a Briol. The next morning, he was abruptly awakened by Ina, who flung the window open. She commented that he must be tired since he had returned late the night before. Yuri replied that he had gone to visit the royal archive in the palace. She asked why so suddenly, and he said he was looking for a specific document. Among all the family's historical records, he found a note saying, "The founder had a brother, a man who had abandoned his honor and was completely erased from history, not even leaving behind his name. That man was the Death Knight he encountered, the true owner of the sword he now carried." Interrupting his thoughts, Ina said he needed to change clothes immediately because His Majesty was looking for him. She didn't know the exact reason, but said that after meeting with Hernando, the king had called for him right away. Yuri grew concerned, remembering that, upon leaving the dungeon, Hernando had said he would report everything to the king. Yuri asked if that was really necessary, and the mage replied that it was. Yuri thought to himself that he really had done it. Later, he met with Fiore, and his father said that not only had he left the palace without permission, but he had also found the secret dungeon of the founder founder, hidden within the Sword Mountain. Yuri confirmed, saying it happened by chance. His father asked if he could control the sword he now wielded, and Yuri answered yes. Fiore approached and commented that he had heard his son had changed a lot in recent days, as said by Ina, Bernard, Saned, and even Hernando himself. Then he asked what had caused that change. Yuri grew nervous before answering. Fiore asked if he didn't want to talk about it, and Yuri said that wasn't the case. His father insisted, asking why he seemed so hesitant. Yuri said it was because and then clenched his fists. Fiore calmed down and asked him to speak. Yuri explained that he had a dream, and in that dream he had committed a grave crime. When his father asked what it was, Yuri said it was not protecting Bryol until the end. In that dream, a great war had occurred. Many people were massacred. He did everything he could to win, but failed. And when the kingdom fell, he ran away, lost his honor, and died alone and dishonored. After waking from that dream, Yuri realized that the necklace his mother had given him was gone. He thought maybe that dream was actually a warning left by her. Fiore asked what had caused the fall of the kingdom in the dream, but Yuri thought it was still too soon to mention the Empire. Since he was trying to change the future, there was a chance the Empire might not even invade, so he replied that he wasn't sure. He only saw an army he couldn't identify. Fiore said that was fine. He didn't know if it had just been a nightmare or a true warning either, but he was happy his son was doing his best. Yuri thought that everything he was doing was just a way to atone for the sins of his past life. Fiore then said there was one more thing Yuri needed to hear from his father, and asked him to hand over the sword. At that moment, it was explained who Fiore Briol was, a genius who wielded a sword as soon as he learned to walk. He was the first in many paths, and wrote his name into the continent's history with his power alone. At that point in the story, he was considered the most powerful on the continent, one of the strongest swordsmen in the world. Yuri mentioned that he had never entered his father's personal training hall, and Fiore explained that he believed none of his children had any talent with the sword. Yuri stated that he believed he was talented, and Fiore asked if he truly thought that. He then drew his sword and questioned what his son considered sword talent to be, whether it was strength, reflexes, speed, or combat wisdom. He said that even if someone had all of that, it wouldn't make them a true swordsman. The most important thing was the element that allowed someone to surpass their own limits, something stronger than fear or a sense of justice. Fiore then focused so much power that the aura around him changed, and the mana he released took on a different color. As he sheathed his sword again, he said he didn't know the exact name for that thing, but it might be something like destiny. Yuri asked if he was really talking about destiny, and Fiore replied that it could be, or it might not be, depending on each person's interpretation. Yuri thought that perhaps, in his past life, he had not been destined to follow the path of the sword. But now, in this life, after everything he had seen, he began to question it. Fiore then asked what his son thought about all of that, whether he believed his destiny was to wield a sword, whether he could hear the call of the blade, whether he thought that, in moments of glory, and at the time of his death, he would still be holding a weapon. Pressured, Yuri replied that he didn't know, that he didn't feel anything like that. But Fiore's gaze was terrifying, as if countless eyes were staring into Yuri's soul, forcing him to recall his past traumas. He remembered that he needed to escape, that he was the last of the Briol territory, that he had to save everyone. He remembered the war, the deaths, the flames, the allies falling before his eyes. Yuri returned to the past, wondering why Briol was in flames, until he saw the enemies approaching. The Empire was advancing, saying the third prince, the last remnant of Briol, was there, and Yuri wondered if he had returned to that hell. When one of the soldiers rushed to kill him, he had just enough reflex to block and kill him. The scene repeated itself, with the soldiers of Briol sacrificing themselves so the prince could escape. Yuri questioned whether all of it was just a dream. Was Briol truly destined to fall like that? He told himself he couldn't let it happen again. Instead of fleeing, instead of retreating, he firmly gripped the sword of guilt. He remembered that he had made a vow, a duty to fulfill. He was no longer afraid of the enemies, even while surrounded by them. He knew he had to carry Briol's burden to the end. He then infused his sword with mana and began to kill all the enemies. It didn't matter who appeared in front of him. He defeated them without mercy, cutting off heads and destroying the Empire's soldiers. They said he was a zombie, someone who was already dead but didn't know it yet. But Yuri declared that a descendant of Briol never abandons their honor, even in the face of death. He carried that duty to the end and walked straight into certain death without showing fear. At that moment, his father Fiore woke him from the trance by asking if he could hear his voice. The first thing Yuri said upon waking was something about his army, but when he looked around, around, he saw nothing. Fiore explained that it had all been an illusion, but Yuri was still trembling and sweating because it had felt incredibly real to him. Fiore then said that in the end, he had been mistaken because his son was indeed a great swordsman, not only talented but also carrying a sense of duty. Yuri said he had made his decision and wondered why his father suddenly looked so serious. He thought that maybe Fiore believed his son would die the moment he stepped into battle, so he tried to reassure him by saying not to worry so much. After all, he was a genius, but his father's response was a direct punch to his face. Later at the training center, Yuri showed up to train with Bernard, now sporting a large bump on his forehead. Bernard asked who had created that masterpiece on his face, and Yuri replied that it was his father. Bernard commented that even if Fiore had gone a bit overboard, it didn't mean that day's training would be easy. Yuri said he was ready, but upon reflection he realized that Bernard only stayed in Briolle because of a duel promised with Fiore. Yuri then asked if Bernard remained in Briolle because of the promised duel with his father, and Bernard confirmed it. Yuri asked if he would still stay there if he knew the duel would never happen, and Bernard replied that he probably wouldn't. Yuri thought he was rather cold about it, but Bernard explained that if Yuri showed him something convincing, such as the swordsmanship of their ancestor Eric Briolle, he might reconsider. Yuri asked if he wanted to learn the technique of the founding king, and Bernard said yes, because it piqued his interest. Yuri replied that he couldn't teach that technique. Bernard said it didn't matter if he hadn't fully mastered it. He had already expected that. Yuri admitted he was right about that, but explained that wasn't the reason. Using his mana, Yuri said that what he used was his own sword technique, called One with the Mana, also known as Soul Fracture. Bernard said he had never heard of anything like that before, since mana methods were usually created to enhance sword techniques, not to be the technique itself. Yuri explained that was exactly why he couldn't teach it to Bernard. He would only be able to absorb half of its essence. Still, Bernard said it was fine, that receiving half a technique was enough for him, and that he would remain in Briolle as long as Yuri kept teaching him. He believed that even with only a part, he could achieve great results. Yuri thought that man was truly confident, but that was a good thing, and said it was a deal. So they began their training. Bernard asked Yuri to demonstrate his technique, of course, by fighting him. But before that, Bernard revealed that he had withheld one last thing. He said that, in fact, he was going to stay in Briolle anyway, because His Majesty had requested that he continue serving for another 10 years. Yuri was furious upon hearing that, and Bernard teased him by asking if he wasn't going to attack him for that, saying that in that case, he would strike first. Still recovering from the emotional blow he had just received, Yuri charged at Bernard in rage, asking why he had only said that now. When the sun was setting, Yuri rested in his room, thinking that the future was changing. A new future, different from the one he had seen before, where Briolle did not fall. The simple fact that Bernard remained in Briolle, even without any grand feats or notable achievements, was already proof of that. Yuri knew that changing the future was an overwhelming responsibility, but he was determined to do it, little by little. This time, he would stop the Empire's advance, no matter what he had to face. At that moment, Ina appeared, saying she agreed with him, but that this time, he couldn't go looking for trouble. Yuri stood up and asked why she was saying that, and Ina explained that every day he got himself involved in some kind of problem. She warned him that the next day he had an important meeting with the Senate, and that His Majesty had demanded his presence. Yuri had no idea about it and complained, saying it was nonsense. Ina replied that the meeting would be held in the morning and that nearly all senators would be present. She firmly held Yuri's hand and asked him not to punch any of them in the face, no matter how difficult or irritating they might be. Yuri said it was fine and promised he wouldn't act that way again. The next morning during the Senate meeting, Yuri thought Ina had been right because he really wanted to punch that man. That man was Duke Chitari, who argued that it wasn't proper for the prince to learn a mana method that had not yet been approved. Yuri thought they were supposed to be discussing the management of the kingdom, but it was clear that the room had become a place where the king's authority was being challenged. In that moment, he understood why his father disliked participating in these meetings. Chitari stated it would be much better if the prince learned the traditional method of the Briolles. One of the senators asked how an unapproved method could have been created by the founding king, and Chitari asked how he could be so sure of that. The other senators reacted, saying Chitari was now doubting the prince. Chitari replied that he wasn't doubting, only expressing concern for Yuri's future. Yuri wondered if the whole discussion had been started just to determine which mana method he should use. He said he was touched, overwhelmed by so much concern, but he thought to himself that in his past life, Chitari had been a cowardly traitor who hid behind the empire. To him, that man's words had no value. Chitari turned to Captain Sanad and asked what he thought of the situation. The captain responded that he couldn't reach a conclusion yet, as every mana method had its pros and cons and also varied depending on the individual. Jatari seized on this response and said that even the captain of the royal guard was uncertain, claiming the method was too dangerous. He insisted that the prince should give up and choose a safer method like everyone else. One senator corrected him, saying that Saned hadn't expressed an opinion, only stated facts. Still, another senator supporting Jatari insisted it was the same thing, reinforcing the idea that the duke was just concerned about the prince. The senators began staring at each other in silence, and Yuri realized the situation was far from good. Two of them openly agreed with Jatari, and Yuri understood that a conspiracy was forming among the senators. It was clear that Jatari was gaining the upper hand in that environment. It was explained that when someone begins practicing a mana method, it is still possible to switch to another method as long as there's no deep bond formed. However, because of what Yuri had experienced during the battle with the Death Knight and the illusion, the soul fracture had already embedded itself into his mana core. He knew he couldn't explain all of this openly, so he would have to omit certain facts. While he was considering how to respond, one senator stated that Yuri's words were convincing but not enough, so he wanted to share his opinion too. This man asked how many in that room had ever fought an orc. His name was Baron Calcio Erancia, and the senators involved in the conspiracy exchanged glances, trying to understand who this man was that was ruining their plans. Not even Jatari knew him. Calcio introduced himself as a free baron, and Jatari questioned whether a baron even had the right to sit at that table with senators. Calcio replied that he honestly didn't want to be there either, but Count Sidor, the guardian lord of the Briol border, had sent him in place of his usual representative. Yuri recognized the name. Sidor was known as a true soldier, loyal to the territory, someone who had spent most of his life on the battlefield. He never attended noble meetings and always sent a representative, even for Senate sessions. Everyone wondered why he had sent Calcio personally. Calcio said Sidor hadn't given a clear explanation, but now, watching several nobles playing at being politicians, he finally understood why he had been sent. According to him, the type of mana or method used didn't matter on the battlefield. Whether it was from the Empire, from Briol, or from the Ancients, it was all irrelevant. In the end, what truly mattered was the user. Then Calcio asked what the prince thought of that. Yuri replied that, as the third prince of Briol, he saw no reason to consider it controversial to master the method left behind by the founding king. Despite all objections, he would continue training with that method. Calcio said that if the prince himself had chosen to follow the founder's path, then who were those irrelevant nobles to oppose it? According to him, everything they said were just the words of people who had never held a sword in their lives, and Yuri had to hold back from laughing at that. Jatari said those words were insulting, and Calcio apologized, explaining that his family wasn't very good with etiquette. After all, when you fight orcs every day on the border, you lose that kind of formality. Then he repeated the question, how many there had ever fought an orc in their lives? No one answered. Calcio then asked if the senators really believed the monsters cared what mana method a knight was using. One of Jatari's allied senators argued that even so, the prince was very young and might not make the best decision. Yuri responded by asking whether it was worth, over a single wrong decision, abandoning his current method and restarting all his training. He questioned whether the senator even knew that doing so was impossible in his case. Calcio commented that it seemed the prince would not change his mind. Then he asked directly what the senators intended to do, whether they wanted to force the removal of the mana method from the prince's core. The senator replied that that wasn't what he meant, and Calcio followed up by asking what exactly was the purpose of the entire discussion then. Calcio asked if the prince agreed, and Yuri was beginning to like him. Calcio commented that they could be discussing truly important matters, but instead, they were sitting there stressing out over nothing, as if the people from the royal capital had too much free time. Jatari was irritated by the provocation and replied that it was very rude. In response, Calcio said that the border had been very quiet lately, but when he mentioned that, someone asked if quiet to him meant thousands of people dying every day. It seemed Jatari had no idea what was happening. The daily reports indicated that soldiers were dying so that nobles like him could sit there and enjoy the perks of nobility. On the very day Calcio had left, 4 men had died, and he said that he himself had to cover the bodies of the comrades he used to have breakfast with every morning. He stated that orcs never rest. They live to fight, kill, and massacre. After that, everyone went silent, not knowing what to say, while Yuri reflected on the orcs, since Calcio was so insistent on that point. Yuri remembered the border issues with the Duchy of Klein, and how when Briol went to war with Klein, the orcs took advantage of the situation to invade the territories and cause great damage. He then asked Calcio if the orcs' movements had changed, and Calcio replied that yes, they had been acting suspiciously in recent times. Yuri asked about the Duchy of Klein, wanting to know if part of their army was still stationed at the border, but Calcio explained explained that those forces had recently retreated. Yuri then asked about the state of the border cities, and Calcio said they were completely devastated, with survivors being enslaved. The situation was terrible. Yuri suspected that something was very wrong there, possibly a civil war, and commented that the Duke's third son might be causing trouble. The people present were confused by that comment, and Yuri, realizing he had said it out loud, ended the meeting by saying that was enough for today. Jatari tried to say something before he left, but Yuri cut him off, saying that debating which mana method he would use was a waste of time compared to more urgent issues like Klein's situation and the orc threat. He asked them to stop acting like rebellious teenagers, throwing tantrums. Meanwhile, at an inn in the territory, Calcio contacted his lord through a communication device. He confirmed the rumors that the third prince had completely changed and remarked that the boy seemed truly promising. The lord instructed him to investigate further if necessary, and to keep an eye on Yuri, saying he would get in touch again soon. When the call ended, Calcio remarked to himself that the place was actually quite peaceful, considering he was used to the chaos of massacres on the frontier. Shortly after, he saw a hooded figure walking through the streets and suspected it was the third prince. Something strange was happening. That night, it really was Yuri, hooded and accompanied by Hernando. Hernando said he had found a more discreet location, just as the prince had requested. His heart was racing because he loved these nighttime escapades, remembering how he used to get into trouble when he was younger. He admitted that back then he had been a real delinquent, but nowadays he had a reputation to uphold. Yuri replied that Hernando could leave if he wanted to, but Hernando refused, saying he couldn't leave him alone. Walking around with a prince at night in secret was practically rebelling against the kingdom, and he wondered which was worse. He asked where exactly they were going, and Yuri said they were heading to the casino, the largest illegal casino in the capital. Hernando was stunned, unable to believe what he had just heard. Hernando pointed out that Yuri had said he had stopped doing that kind of shady thing, but Yuri replied that he wasn't going to do anything bad. He didn't even explain what he was going to do. He just asked if Hernando knew where the casino was. Hernando didn't know, and Yuri explained that he wasn't going there to gamble. It was all for the good of Briol. Hernando found that hard to believe, but said that if Yuri wasn't going to get punished for it, then fine. He would guide him to the casino, even though he was more excited about it than he should have been. As they walked, Yuri thought about his past life. Among the people of Briol, there had always been those who left the biggest impact. There was the mustached man with loads of money who had ties to the underworld, the business titan who founded the most successful merchant guild on the continent, and finally, the legendary assassin who took control of the underworld, spreading fear and eliminating the former leader, Goryo, who now held that title. At the casino, Goryo greeted them by saying it was an honor to have such a distinguished guest as a prince in his establishment. Yuri replied that he assumed everyone there already knew who he was, and Goryo confirmed it, saying that a visit from the royal court mage and third prince was something even he couldn't ignore, which was why he had received them personally. Yuri said that had been a wise decision, since he wasn't there to gamble, and Goryo clearly knew that. Goryo then invited them to sit and talk. Later, Hernando, surprised, asked what he meant by saying they weren't there to gamble. Yuri hadn't even told him that, but simply told him to stay quiet. Goryo commented that if Yuri wasn't there to gamble, maybe he was looking for a loan. Yuri replied that actually he wanted to invest money. Goryo suggested that perhaps he was trying to create his own private fund, and remarked that the fact he was handling this with the king of the underworld instead of a capital bank showed that Yuri had very high ambitions. Yuri responded that the interrogation had gone far enough, and that wasn't part of their agreement. Goryo admitted he had been rude, but Yuri said not to worry, since in the end, Goryo would be the one profiting from it. Goryo then asked to get straight to the point, and wanted to know exactly what the prince intended to use the funds for. Yuri explained that he would use the borrowed money to purchase mugrania, a spice from the Klein region, because he knew that the demand for it would soon increase significantly. Hernando, confused, thought the prince had gone mad for doing something like that so suddenly. Goryo remarked that mugrania was indeed an essential ingredient for luxury fragrances, but questioned whether it was really worth such an investment, showing some doubt. Yuri insisted that the demand would indeed rise, and Hernando thought that although Klein was dealing with problems involving orcs and cities being overtaken, that alone wouldn't be enough to raise the prices. However, seeing Yuri's determined expression, he realized the prince wasn't acting on impulse. Everything seemed carefully calculated. Goryo also noticed that this was no longer the same Prince Yuri as before. Now he truly seemed to know what he was doing. Yuri asked that they discuss the numbers and quantities as investors, not as prince and subject, and inquired how much he could borrow. Goryo then dismissed everyone from the room and had Yuri sign a promise promissory note. Later, already outside the casino, Hernando still could hardly believe the prince had borrowed money from Goryo. He complained that it was completely unfair, since he hadn't had any fun that night. Yuri hadn't even pretended to gamble. Yuri replied that if he had told the truth from the beginning, Hernando would definitely have told his father, and they both knew it. Now they were on their way to the merchant guild, and Yuri was thinking that Mugranja was actually a guaranteed profit item. The only alchemist who knew how to produce the essence efficiently lived close to Klein, but he would die during the Civil War. After that, a generic substitute would emerge on the market, and pure original Mugranja would become extremely valuable. He knew he couldn't entrust this plan to just anyone. When they arrived at the place, they found a complete dump. Yuri said that was the place, and Hernando was shocked, thinking it looked horrible, grim, and creepy. Still, Yuri knocked on the door and asked if Elaine Wood was there. Hernando tried to persuade the prince to wait, saying he should leave things like that to the guild. But Elaine, opening the door, asked exactly who he was. She was Elaine Wood. Yuri introduced himself as the third prince of Briol, and said he wanted to entrust Elaine with an important task. Later, as they walked away, Hernando asked if he had completely lost his mind. Yuri commented that Hernando clearly felt comfortable talking to a prince, however he pleased. And Hernando replied that anyone would say the same. It was madness. He couldn't understand how Yuri could trust so much Mugranja to a failed business like that. Yuri thought that maybe Elaine was failing now, but soon she would rise. In no time, she would be recognized across the entire continent. She would become the head of a merchant guild with unprecedented potential. Unlike Goryo, who hid behind the illusion of trust, Elaine treated every promise made to a client as sacred. In his past life, she was a legendary merchant. This time, he would make sure she surpassed even the mythical level. She would become a true legend. Hernando, still in disbelief, asked if that wasn't enough for one day. But Yuri said there was still one more thing. Instead of returning, he went down a dark and shady alley, which made Hernando ask where he was going. Yuri thought that with this, both the bright and the dark sides of the underworld would be at his side. Only one person remained to be convinced. Later, in the city slums, where the homeless crowded and people fought over a piece of bread, Yuri finally found who he was looking for. He approached a girl and introduced himself as the third prince of the territory. In his mind, he recognized that figure. She was the assassin who, in a cruel way, killed Goryo in his past life, the only surviving member of a vanished bloodline from the underworld. Asana asked what exactly a prince was doing there, and Yuri replied that she didn't need to be so cautious around him, as he had only come because he thought he could help. He then asked Hernando to hand over what they had brought, and Hernando gave her a pouch full of money. Yuri noticed there was a child behind Asana, and remembered that, in his past life, Asana had borrowed a large sum of money from Goryo precisely to treat that child's illness. However, the moment she made that deal, her life was ruined. She ended up following the path of assassination, but eventually was recognized for her skills. Yuri's goal was to prevent that from happening again. Yuri told Asana to take the money and bring the child to the temple for treatment. Asana asked what he wanted in return, and the prince replied that he only wanted something that would make her remember who he was and what he had done. After that, he left with Hernando, who asked why he had given a bag full of money to a beggar like her. Yuri answered that it was just an investment in the future, as he had now connected with the three people he would need. There was only one last thing to do, so he asked Hernando for another favor. Yuri asked what exactly Hernando had seen in the tomb of the founding king, and Hernando replied that he saw bets, lots of bets. He said he had gambled in a casino and that his life was a gamble. Yuri found that concerning, but simply told Hernando to keep everything that had happened that day a secret. However, the next morning, Hernando was giving his report to the king, who said he had heard that he had gone out with Yuri the night before, and asked him to tell everything that happened. Hernando replied that he was convinced by the third prince to leave the palace with him, and that they went straight to the biggest casino in the capital. Fiore asked if Hernando had gambled there, and he confirmed that he had, saying that was all they did. He also said the prince was terrible at card games and lost all the money he had. However, Hernando thought about everything that had happened after that, remembering that the prince had taken money from Goryo and given it to a merchant and also to a beggar. He knew he couldn't simply tell the king that, especially since he had promised to keep it a secret. So Hernando just said that the prince had walked through the streets to see how the people lived, and that he was interested in the reality of the common folk. Fiore asked if he returned after that, and Hernando said yes. And that was everything. Fiore seemed thoughtful about the answer, and asked if Hernando would go to the ball. He said yes, and Fiore commented that he thought Hernando wasn't interested. Hernando replied that people changed their minds, and that it had been a long time since he last danced. The next morning, Yuri Yuri was back in training, taking quite a beating from Bernard. During training, Yuri commented that Bernard was quite popular, as the maids wouldn't stop looking at him. He also said there would be a ball, and maybe one of them wanted to invite him, but he already had a guaranteed partner. Bernard, however, said he wasn't really interested in that, and preferred to return to the topic of sword technique. He said Yuri was right, that there really wasn't a definitive form to that technique, and Yuri replied that he had already said so, because the secret was to move according to the flow of mana. Bernard said that was very hard to understand, and that he would need to see it in a real fight or study it further. Either way, he acknowledged that the third prince was progressing very quickly in his training, and that his mana was excellent. To be honest, Bernard said he was surprised, as he didn't think Yuri would do so well with mana. Yuri thought he felt a bit guilty about that, as he was trying to erase the Briole method he had learned in his past life. But all Bernard said was for him not to rush. Still, he showed concern, thinking Yuri was advancing too fast. He had already reached a very high level for his age, but perhaps his child's body wouldn't be able to keep up with such progress, since his physical development wasn't advancing as fast as his technique. Yuri said he would keep that in mind and try to find a good balance. He said they could continue training, but now he wanted to use real swords. He thought he no longer cared. He just wanted to be strong and fast. Bernard agreed, and Yuri asked what he thought about a bet. If he managed to land a hit on Bernard during the duel, then Bernard would have to go to the ball with someone. Bernard replied no, because he would win anyway, and Yuri would probably cancel the bet if he lost. Yuri said they would see soon enough, and using his mana, charged quickly at Bernard. Despite the effort, he didn't win in the end. A few days later, on the eve of the ball, a carriage arrived in the territory. Inside were two blonde individuals. The man was the second prince of the empire, Georg Ivarna Granzayan, who commented that she hadn't taken her eyes off the window since they left. The woman was Ekaterina Luarna Granzayan, the princess of the empire, and she replied that there was someone she really wanted to meet. That night, Yuri was getting dressed in formal clothes for the ball. He commented that there were too many decorations and that it was overly flashy. Ina said he looked great, reminding him that he had always liked that kind of outfit. When she finished dressing him, Yuri asked if she could dance a bit with him to practice, since he didn't have anyone else. He noticed she made a strange expression and asked what it was. Ina replied by asking if he wasn't going to step on her foot on purpose. Yuri assured her he wouldn't, and when he pulled her to dance, told her to follow his lead. Ina asked if he was messing with her, but admitted he was actually a good dancer. Yuri asked who she had danced with so much, and she said she was quite popular in the village where she lived, but had never danced with someone so short before. Yuri told her to wait and see, that he would grow and she would bite her tongue. Right after that, she stepped on his foot and said it was an innocent mistake. When she stepped again, she said they were still mistakes. Later, at the ball, everything was very beautiful and elegant. The king of Briole, Fiore, watched everything from the throne, especially his three sons. Yuri then noticed that Count Sador was also present. Last time, only Calcio Arancia had attended, but now Sador was there as well. He also noticed that the first prince had glasses hanging from his clothes and asked if his eyesight had worsened, but his brother said it wasn't serious enough to worry about. Soon after, it was announced that a very important person was entering the ball. It was Georg, the second prince of the empire. Fiore personally greeted him, thanking him for the visit, and Georg replied that he was the one grateful for the invitation. He had brought his sister, and when Ekaterina introduced herself, Yuri was fascinated by her beauty, just like in the past. However, he thought that all those dreams, that beauty, and that love were shattered. He decided he could no longer get close to Ekaterina, not after what had happened. He would not make the same mistake again, even if she seemed interested. Later, people were settling in and talking. Yuri noticed that, as expected, Cedric had already found a dance partner, or rather, several. He was very kind and danced with as many women as he could, and they were all enchanted by him. Compared to him, Yuri had only Ekaterina. The second prince invited her to dance, and Yuri thought he was a failure, wondering who would want to be with someone like him. At that moment, Ina approached, bringing a cookie to cheer him up. Yuri asked if it wasn't too tiring to serve at the ball, but Ina replied that compared to taking care of him, it was quite easy. Yuri then said he wanted lots of cookies, and Ina told him that if he wanted more, he just had to call her. Yuri became thoughtful about everything, until his thoughts were interrupted by Georg Ivarna Granzayan. Yuri knew exactly who that man was. In the past, he had commanded the troops in the palace of the king of Briole. Still, Yuri greeted him politely, as if nothing had happened, although inside he felt deep hatred. Outwardly, he stayed calm, but inside, he wanted to be far from that man. Georg said he knew who Yuri was, and just his gaze made the prince nervous. as if he were trying to pull something from inside his mind. He commented that Yuri was 13 years old, just as expected from a son of Fiore, and said that he had great talent. Yuri thought that man was already testing and threatening someone he had barely met. It was frightening to see that even young Georg was already at such a high level of power. He concluded that all of them were cursed. At that moment, Ina tripped and dropped the tray, dirtying Georg's cloak. She said he was the symbol of the kingdom, and that what she had done was a disgrace. All she could do was apologize. Georg then turned and declared that, according to the crown's law, the mistake of a servant like her should be punished with death. Yuri immediately realized he was doing it on purpose, just to hurt Ina. Georg said the law was clear, but Fiore appeared and asked if he wanted to interrupt the ball and see blood spilled right there. He said that if Georg wanted something like that, he should do it in his own land. Georg sincerely apologized, stating that the Empire and the Kingdom of Briol had always respected each other until now. Fiore agreed it was true, but said it seemed Georg no longer wanted to maintain that respect. He asked if he remembered Gatensha, when Fiore himself executed a knight of the Empire. Georg said they respected the king's honor, but that he hadn't taken responsibility for that act, and asked not to bring up the subject again for the good of both nations. Yuri thought that in the past, his father had killed a knight of the Empire, and now that topic was resurfacing. That meant the family's honor was at stake. Georg promised there wouldn't be that much blood, but Yuri understood that to stop him would be the same as challenging the Empire. Even with all the conditions that bound him, necessity, reality, reason, and power, Yuri knew that Briol never abandoned its honor. That was the Briol oath. Yuri then said that Ina was his servant, and anything she did wrong was his responsibility. It was not up to Georg to punish her, since he too was a prince, and should respect his authority. Yuri thought that in the past, he had been considered a criminal, and his sentence was his life. He never had a choice. But now he did. Georg replied that instead of executing the maid, he would challenge the prince to a duel. He started laughing loudly, finding it amusing, and asked if his name was really Yuri. Everyone at the ball was shocked by the scene. Georg looked at the king and said he was considering accepting the third prince's suggestion, and asked if that would be acceptable. Though tense, Fiore agreed. Georg then declared that Yuri would have to fight, but to preserve his dignity, he would choose a representative. Since Yuri was still very young, he would use the newest member of the royal guard as an opponent. He said he would send this person soon. Once the duel was settled, Yuri approached Ina and told her that now she could get up and go rest in her room. But Ina replied that after what he had done for her, she couldn't just walk away. Yuri told them not to worry about him, and the other maids took Ina to the dormitory. On his way back to the ball, Yuri ran into Ekaterina, but he thought that no longer mattered, so he turned and walked in the opposite direction. Later, while walking through the dark corridors, he met one of his brothers and asked what he was thinking about at that moment. Yuri explained that he couldn't just let Ina die, and the prince commented that his little brother was too kind. Yuri thought it had been a long time since he received that kind of affection from his family. The first prince then asked if he wanted help, saying that the person he was going to fight probably wouldn't be as weak as Georg had promised. Yuri replied that he knew that, and also knew that his brothers were worried about him. The prince said then he didn't need to explain, because he would handle it. Yuri said there was no need because he had started it, so he would finish it himself, though he knew his brother always did everything he could to resolve things when he set his mind to it, and that was why he trusted him. He asked how the ball was, and the first prince replied that it was a mess, and that he could rest. Yuri thought that in his past life, if Briol hadn't fallen, the first prince certainly would have made a great king. In this life, he wanted to live to see what kind of reign his brother would have, and that's why he would fight to make it happen, no matter what he faced, because he would fight for a better future. The next morning, Yuri was already prepared for the duel. Everyone who had been at the ball was there watching. Hernando commented that the third prince was about to duel, and asked the captain what he thought about it. Sand replied that the opponent's energy was very stable, that he was very skilled with the sword, even without being a knight yet, and that the Imperial Guard was indeed very talented. Even so, he was a bit worried about Yuri, but Hernando, smiling, told him to take a look, as Yuri was just stretching with complete calmness. According to Hernando, there was no reason to worry, because Yuri clearly wasn't worried at all. Then it was explained that the title of Great Mage was one of the highest ranks in the Magic Tower, one that no one had ever reached. This title could only be granted to someone who had discovered the origin of magic. Among the spells of that level, there was one that allowed the user to glimpse the fate of a person, or even the fate of the world. This spell was called Fate-Revealing Magic, and in this world, only Hernando would ever reach that level. However, at that moment, he found himself losing money to a child. It was the first time that it had happened since he acquired the spell. He wondered if it was just a coincidence, or if Yuri truly could predict every move of his opponent. The truth was that the boy was very good, and Hernando couldn't read anything about his fate. The only thing Hernando could see was the illusion of the Sword Mountain. He saw a black-haired boy who grew up carrying the symbol of Briol, and even in the face of bloody battles and massacres, he kept wielding his sword against against the enemies. The vision ended in collapse and despair. After seeing all that, Hernando realized that the story, which once seemed like a mere coincidence, actually revolved around a single point. After observing all the recent actions of the prince, who had changed a bit in personality, Hernando became convinced that the spell could really be used on the boy. The only problem was that Prince Yuri was someone without a destined fate, and that was why he was smiling, because there was no reason to worry. Yuri said he was ready and asked how long the little knight would keep swinging his sword in the air like he was swatting flies. Georg asked if Yuri did not want more time to prepare, but Yuri replied that he was always ready. Another knight also declared he was ready, so Fiore himself decided he would start and act as judge for the duel. They prepared for a few seconds, and when the duel began, Yuri was the quickest to act, not only hitting the knight but also drawing blood. Then the two exchanged heavy blows. The knight was able to counterattack, but he did not land any truly impactful hits on Yuri, whose face was already cut. Suddenly Fiore called for Hernando and asked what he thought would happen. Hernando, observing the duel, saw that Yuri was being hit but responded with strength, continuing even while wounded and showing determination. He replied that honestly he did not know. Fiore reminded him that Hernando himself had said his arrival in Briol was guided by the heavens, and asked if it was time to leave the territory. Hernando replied no. Fiore said it was good he would not leave, and Hernando said he was flattered to be welcomed so well, even as a mage. Fiore warned him that excessive modesty could bring misfortune. Hernando asked who he thought was stronger, the Imperial Guard Knight with his heavy sword and piercing eyes, or Yuri. Fiore replied that he thought the opponent was stronger. Hernando said he had been thinking the same. He reflected that he had come to Briol because of divine signs, and believed the person who could change the fate of the world was the most powerful being on the continent, someone who was sitting beside him. But since that person had not yet drawn his sword, he thought there was no reason to stay in the territory. Hernando thought maybe he should leave, but upon seeing that duel, he realized that time had passed. He decided to stay. When Yuri seemed defeated, he gripped his sword more firmly and declared that it was enough to test his opponent, and that he would now end it all at once. The opponent noticed that Yuri had suddenly become much faster, and the attack almost sliced his neck. The knight thought he would die at that moment, and everyone around was shocked by what they saw. Even the captain was left speechless, barely able to believe it. At the last moment, Yuri turned the sword, and what was cut was not the knight's neck, but his sword. Yuri overpowered him, ending the duel. When the knight admitted defeat, everyone celebrated the third Prince of Briol. Hernando thought the divine signs were right. He had found someone who was truly worth it. Life became death, and death became life at the tip of the third prince's sword. Fate, which had already been written, was changed by that boy. Now, every step he took defied the will of the heavens. To Hernando, Yuri was someone outside the fate of this world, someone who had transcended the bonds of destiny itself. He stood and applauded, recognizing how incredible Yuri was. He thought he did not know what lay ahead, but he knew that boy would change the world's future. 5 years passed after that event. A young maid believed she could quickly finish all her tasks, but she was overwhelmed, not knowing how to do everything at once. If someone saw her running around, she would be in trouble. And that was exactly what happened. A prince caught her and asked if she was new there. When the maid saw his face, she realized he was one of the princes. Trying to remember what she had been instructed to do in such situations, she thought that the piercing gaze and heavy steps could only mean he was the third prince. Nervously, she tried to respond, saying she had something to do. The prince asked the maid if she had some kind of manual teaching how to work there, and if it did not say she should avoid crossing paths with royalty. He said that he would personally teach her that day. But before he did anything, someone called out to his brother. When the maid heard the voice, she recognized who it was. She saw someone dressed lightly, calm, walking with ease and always carrying a sword. She thought that he was the real third prince. Yuri appeared and asked if his brother was bothering another maid again. Later, Yuri was eating some delicious cookies. When he confronted his brother, the brother replied that he was not bothering anyone. As a thank you, the maid had given him the cookies, and it was indeed a tasty reward. But Yuri soon returned to more serious thoughts. He had already reached the so-called unarmed state, a stage where a mana method user no longer needed a sword to be dangerous, as they could create a dense layer of mana around their body. Yuri had already achieved that level. He reflected that it had been 5 years since his regression after being killed by Lohan's sword, and he knew that his peaceful days would soon come to an end. People were probably already talking about him. Later, Yuri went to a place where a heated discussion was happening. The guard at the door was worried and informed him that the prince was being ignored because everyone was too focused on the conference. He suggested Yuri come back later, but Yuri refused and broke the door open using his mana method. He apologized for the excessive force, explained that he had knocked first, but since no one heard, he knocked a bit harder. The guard, surprised, asked if he really called that knocking on the door. Yuri turned to his father and said he wanted to join the conference. Then he sat at the table as if nothing had happened, completely ignoring the wind blowing from the broken door. One of the senators resumed the topic that had been interrupted, saying they did not have enough soldiers to support the Allied forces, and others suggested ignoring the Empire's request. This was considered irresponsible, as it could further damage the relationship with the Empire, and the discussion intensified. Yuri watched everything in silence, realizing that everyone was just calculating losses and gains. He thought the timeline was following the same path as his past life. At the time, the Empire had requested that all nations send troops for a joint attack against the orcs in the south, but the plan failed. The orcs went out of control and became a threat not only to the nation that was supposed to face them, but to all others, except the Empire, which remained unscathed. At that moment, Yuri realized that everything had been orchestrated by the Empire from the beginning. In the process, they lost important people, including Leon, one of the senators present in that room, Leon Flandre. But Yuri would not allow that to happen again. When one of the senators insisted they would not send anything, and another asked if they were starving or had no knights, suggesting at least sending a small troop, Yuri told everyone to be quiet. He said he would go himself. He would join the Allied forces and, in doing so, demonstrate the sincerity of the territory of Briol, fulfilling his duty as a noble. He declared he would do it in the name of Briol. Fiore, watching, thought that this was indeed a true move. His son had impressed him. Later, the second prince appeared to interrupt Yuri's training, asking if it was true that he would join the Allied forces. He said royalty should not step into that kind of battlefield, but Yuri insisted that it was his duty as royalty and that he would do it for his people. The prince replied that he finally understood his brother's way of thinking. Yuri asked if he had only realized that now, and the prince said he would protect the palace during his absence, then ran off. Yuri said he would be happy if his brother did not cause any trouble. Soon after, Yuri asked Bernard if he was worried about him going to the battlefield. Bernard replied that if Yuri did not do anything too irresponsible, he would return in one piece, so he was not worried. Yuri thanked him for the generous assessment, but Bernard, now speaking seriously, told him to be careful, as the orcs were difficult to deal with and could be far more powerful than they appeared. He said that when an orc appeared with an army and a banner, he became an orc-val, a fierce, strong, and merciless enemy in war. Yuri said there was nothing to worry about because he had his own way. Bernard asked if he already had a plan, and before Yuri could answer, Ina appeared, even more worried than the second prince. However, her appearance was only a prelude to a visitor. Yuri turned to Bernard and said that of course he had a plan, and that this time it was something special. In the guest room, the one waiting for Yuri was Guillermo, the vice president of Elaine's merchant guild. Guillermo explained that Elaine was on a trip and could not come, so he had come in her place. Yuri asked if Elaine was still going on those trips on her own and told him to ask her to take a break from that. Guillermo said she felt good traveling, but assured him that he was not there to talk about her. He had obtained the item he mentioned last time. Yuri said he had done a great job. He had finally gotten the elementals. Guillermo asked if it was really that valuable, since to him they looked like decorative daggers. Yuri explained they were extremely valuable because they were artifacts imbued with ancient magic. Guillermo was terrified when he saw the dagger moving on its own, as if being controlled by telekinesis. Yuri reassured him, saying he was the one controlling it. Guillermo asked if he was really moving the daggers with his own mana, and admitted he did not know Yuri was that strong. Yuri jokingly asked what he thought, that he spent all day lying down doing nothing. Suddenly Yuri felt something strange, but said it was nothing and continued the conversation. He asked them to send a message to Elaine, asking how she was doing, and said that next time he wanted the report from the guild branch in the Empire with as much information as possible. Guillermo replied that of course he would do that, and then asked to take his leave. Soon after, Yuri told the hidden presence that she could come out now if she wanted to. It was Azana, the assassin hidden in the shadows. Yuri asked what had happened with Goryo, and Azana replied that she had left the warning exactly as he asked, right on his bedside. Now Goryo was probably a little frightened. Yuri said it was a good move, since Goryo was always trying to get Elaine's money, and now he had been warned. Azana then asked if he really planned to join the Alliance army. Yuri confirmed that he did. Azana asked him to be careful, and Yuri replied that she talked as if he were going alone. He said she would go with him, that she could do it, and that she would have to keep up with his pace because he would not slow down. Azana replied that any place was like home to her and said they would be in touch later. A few days later, the day of Yuri's departure for combat arrived. The only thing the first prince told him was to be careful. Yuri replied that there was nothing to worry about, that he was invincible, and that the image of Briol would be etched on everyone's face. He said his brother needed to take a break from studying, or his vision would get worse. Then they hugged tightly. Yuri told his brother not to worry, that he would return. When the horn sounded, Fiore began the ceremony. The first to step onto the altar was Yuri. Fiore asked if he was nervous, and Yuri said no, because behind him was a good group. Every soldier he saw was a valuable life he had to carry on his shoulders. Yuri thought it would be impossible for them all to return alive, but he would fight to ensure none of them had a painful death, like in his past life. Fiore asked if he was sure he could do it. If he believed he could, then he had to endure what would come next. The king released his killing intent, and Yuri felt an immense pressure on his body, barely able to move. Instinctively, he knew what it was: death approaching slowly. He thought he would die if he tried to dodge it, but there was a way to reject it. He infused his entire body with mana and blocked his father's blow with everything he had. The king said he had done a great job, and Fiore said that would replace the letter of departure. He wished his son to make sure to return alive. Then Yuri raised his sword before his army, presenting himself as the third prince of Briol, who would lead them all to victory. Thus began the march of the territory of Briol. Meanwhile, in a dark and shadowy chamber, there was an orc locked in a cell, furious. Sidor commented that they would meet again after 5 years, and said he was curious to see how the third prince would perform. Later, the army took a break on the way to their destination. People were drinking and eating, and Yuri found the atmosphere strangely quiet. He asked Raymond how far they had advanced, and Raymond replied that they were already at the entrance of Sidor, just short of reaching the first border city. After that, they would pass through a valley to reach the meeting point in Balshad. Yuri said their pace was good, and Raymond agreed. It was then that Yuri saw a shadow from the past appear before him. The zombie Roland Flandre, the one who had killed him in his previous life. Roland said it was an honor to finally meet him, and knelt before the prince. He stated that he had something important to say, revealing that he greatly admired Yuri ever since the incident 5 years ago. According to him, the third prince had become his idol. His father had told him everything, including how Yuri had raised his sword to protect his own maid, which to him was the example of a true knight. Yuri was even a bit embarrassed, something that rarely happened. He said that yes, he knew Roland's father, Sir Leon, but that they could continue their journey. Roland replied that he was not there because of his father, but because it was an honor to serve Yuri. Raymond reminded them that it was time to depart, and mentioned that Sidor was not exactly a friendly person. If they were not welcomed warmly, Yuri should not be upset. However, when they arrived at the first territory, they found a banner with the message, "Welcome, Third Prince," and a group of knights was waiting. Raymond was surprised, as he had not expected that. Yuri commented that it was a great welcoming ceremony, and the Duke of Sidor himself was present. In fact, his name was Jaime Theodore. Yuri thanked him for the welcome, but Jaime said they were simply paying proper respect to His Majesty. He commented that it was impressive for someone so young to head to the front lines, and asked if Yuri had ever fought against orcs. Yuri almost replied based on his past life, remembering that he had read about it in books, but held back. He said that in fact, most of his soldiers had never seen an orc, but they would learn, because they were good at that. Jaime thought that was excellent, and said that in that case, he would like to offer a gift. Later, they were in the dungeon of the county of Sidor, and Jaime said the gift was inside. Naturally, Yuri went ahead, accompanied by his soldiers, but as soon as they entered, the doors closed behind them. Yuri asked what Jaime was thinking, and he replied not to be so surprised. Then he lit up the entire corridor, and the knights asked if that creature tied up was really an orc. Jaime explained that for now it was just a prisoner. To survive on the battlefield, it was necessary to know the enemy, to understand their habits, instincts, and everything that could be used in combat. Yuri asked what exactly this gift was that they were talking about, and Jaime answered that this was the gift, information about the war. He asked if there could be anything more valuable than that. Yuri acknowledged that it was indeed valuable and thanked him. In his thoughts, he found Jaime even crazier than he had imagined, a man who tortured orcs for information. However, he also noticed that his knights were not feeling comfortable with the situation. Yuri asked the name of one of the knights behind him, and the young man introduced himself as Simon Peshu, son of Baron Wolf. Yuri asked him to speak honestly about what he was thinking. Simon reflected that perhaps they had gone too far, and said that taking prisoners of war was a bit excessive. Yuri replied that he could think that for now, but then he asked Jaime to open the gate of the cage. He told Simon that now it was a battle, and he needed to fight the orc. Simon prepared himself, facing the creature, but suddenly the orc began to bang its head against the ground repeatedly. Simon turned his back, saying that this was ridiculous, that it was just a prisoner, and had already lost its sanity. However, the orc struck him with a direct punch, nearly crushing his head, and immobilized paralyzed him with a chokehold, taking him as a hostage. Yuri immediately ordered everyone to prepare for combat. Jaime warned that part of the orc's tendons had already been cut, but even injured, that was the true capability of an orc. This made it clear to everyone present that they were not dealing with an ordinary creature. And that is it for today. We hope you enjoyed this part of the story. As soon as more chapters are released, we will bring the continuation as quickly as possible. Stay tuned because the development of this journey is just beginning. Until next time.